Hi everyone, this is my first video presentation of the Mental Health Challenges in Early Childhood PowerPoint. I hope you like it. It's not my first try on Screencast-O-Matic, but it's the first one that's going to succeed, I'm hoping. So this slideshow is about mental health challenges in early childhood because that's a really important student learning outcome of our class, to look at how the experiences in early childhood either put us at more risk or buffer us from risks that we may experience later on. So we've talked about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and how those create higher risk for children on physical and emotional levels, and they actually impact the development of the growing brain. And then we've also talked about the importance of securely attached relationships and responsive relationships, and how those kinds of relationships build a stronger brain architecture. Now, the brain architecture we build in early childhood is the brain architecture everything else hooks onto for the rest of our lives. We can heal our brain throughout our lives, and we can change the function of our brain, the function and the structure, but it takes a lot more to do it when we're older. So the most important time is really the first 5 years, and even before that in the womb. So that's what we're going to talk about, some of those connections. Here we go. These resources in the PowerPoint came from the Center on the Developing Child. It's a very amazing resource. They have great videos. I used some videos in the last module. And they also have research briefs and are a really great reference for anytime you're doing a research paper on children and the important things that children need to develop. I have a visitor. I'm telling my students I had a visitor. It's okay. So temperament is really important to consider when we're looking at mental health issues and resources for children. And the temperament is a theory that we have biologically based tendencies in 9 to 11 areas, depending on which temperament theory you use. And those tendencies are thought to remain pretty consistent throughout the lifespan, but they can be intensified by the environment. As we know, the environment is much more important than genes. That's been proven by science now, because the environment decides which genes to turn on. So, for example, I could have schizophrenia in my genes, but I haven't had the kinds of trauma that would turn on that gene, and so I won't develop that mental illness because I don't have the gene. I mean, I don't have the experience that that turned on the gene. So I could have the gene. Who knows, right? So stress-inducing experiences turn on certain genes, and they might not allow, and they might turn off other genes, as do all our experiences, really. And stress-inducing experiences also impact our the development of our brain. Now, if the stress is healthy, then it's going to be a low level of cortisol that makes us awake and engaged in school, for example. But in general, it's like we're not going to feel any stress if we don't care about anything. So we don't want to be on the level of the spectrum where we don't care about anything. We want to be on the level of the spectrum where we're kind of in the middle. Because if we have too much cortisol, then our brain shuts down and we can't learn, we can't engage, we can't access our prefrontal cortex as adults. And I know I've talked about that a few times, that it doesn't fully develop till age 28. So in temperament, it's really important to understand, as a basis for understanding children's mental health, understand the differences in temperament. I also find that this is an amazing tool for self-understanding and understanding the other people we're close to in our lives, both our children, our partners, the children, our students. And so there are some great self-assessment tools online. I'll try to find a link to one to give to you. And some of the areas of temperament that I think are most important to look at are, one is emotional intensity. So I'm a very emotionally intense person. So when I'm sad, I'm sad. When I'm mad, I'm mad. When I'm happy, I'm happy. And it's strong. So most toddlers are emotionally intense all the time. But a kid with a really emotionally intense temperament is going to be more intense, and sometimes that's harder for adults. But if we can create space and not be scared of their emotions, as we've been talking about, it can really help them move through and give them some tools, some internalized tools for resilience they can use the rest of their lives. Now, of course, the most important part there is the responsive, securely attached relationships. So this is all in that context. Prone to fearfulness, some people are more prone to fearfulness, so some kids are going to need more help with that. I'll tell some stories in the micro lectures this week about some of the kids I've worked with that will give you some examples of kids that may have been prone to fearfulness, or may have been, their trauma may have made them prone to fearfulness, or some combination. Sometimes we don't know, but it's fun to explore what might be the causes. Rhythmicity is how much of a routine we like, so everybody's different there. It's harder for parents in our culture that's very scheduled to work with kids who don't have a regular schedule, who don't sleep the same number of hours at night, who are not hungry at the same times. Usually most kids, the routine really helps them. It helps them to know what to expect. But kids with low rhythmicity or where they don't have a regular schedule do much better in cultures that are more responsive to individual schedules and temperaments that are less scheduled and regimented than our society is. Sensitivity to sensory experiences. One to pay attention to is auditory. So a lot of early trauma will lead to auditory sensitivities, and they can trigger traumatic behaviors. So either withdrawing or acting out behaviors. Oh, we're going on. We're going on. I'm not sure. I guess that's the timing of the slideshow. So another piece on the last slideshow is just activity level. If a child's highly active, we need to respond to that and give them opportunities to be active. Okay, so moving on. Early childhood is a time of special vulnerability. And we've talked about this. It's the strongest time period of the influence of the environment of relationships. It's the most important time for a child to have a set of responsive relationships where people are caring for them. So we're basically creating either support or risks or some combination of that in early childhood by the way we interact with children and the kind of relationships we choose to create with them. Harsh and consistent caregiving or depression are negatives or risks. Lack of responsiveness or neglect leads to atrophy in the brain. There's actually some really interesting pictures of the brain that we can look at. That shows that. Depression of the primary caregivers also has been associated with less cognitive development, and we think that's because there's just less interaction. So if there's less interaction, the brain is going to have fewer opportunities to actually grow and build strong neural networks. An interesting report that came out a few years ago is that behavioral inhibition at 7 related to the interaction of two things: genes associated with fear and anxiety in adults, and a mother's report of lack of social support. So that brings a key discussion to the fore. If we're going to support children's mental health, it's not only about our relationships with the children, it's about our relationships with their parents. We need to let their parents know that we are on their team, we are there for them, and we're ready to support them in supporting their child. So that's vital. So differences in early childhood. Behaviors and characteristics associated with mental health challenges in young children are different from older children and very different from adults. So they tend to be more transient. Young children aren't going to stay in their bed when they're depressed and not move and not go out. But they might be more irritable on a regular basis and not be able to move through that irritability. They might have trouble sleeping. If you see major changes in children's behavior, it might indicate the onset of a challenge that you really want to look at. Whenever there's a major change in children's behavior, you want to look for what the source is. And sometimes it could be developmental and it's just going to pass in a couple weeks. And sometimes it could be a new experience they're having that they're gaining mastery over, and it will also pass. It could also be a traumatic experience it's not gonna pass. It could be a transition in their life where they're moving. When parents get separated or divorced, it usually takes at least 6 to 12 months for them to adjust. So 6 to 12 months of pretty high stress, but usually most kids adjust after that and they do pretty well. And again, the most important thing in that situation is that the parents not bad talk each other. If the parents can put aside their own differences and speak highly of the other person and how much the other person really loves their child, the child will do better, because the child we don't want to put them in the situation where they have to choose. So we really need to make some changes in the way that we approach mental health related to this. So we need new approaches to diagnosis, and we need to integrate support for children into therapy for parents and caregivers. That reminds me of something I meant to mention on the last slide. When we look at the new approaches for diagnosis, in the beginning, bipolar diagnosis could only be applied to children who were either 16 or 18 years and up. Then somebody wrote a paper and said that they thought that a child they were working with had bipolar disorder. And now the youngest child diagnosed with bipolar disorder was a year and a half. Every time I say that, I'm completely shocked. I feel that is just seems completely impossible, but it's true. And our society has become so intent on medicating children and diagnosing people and pathologizing normal behaviors that we've diagnosed a year and a half a child who's a year and a half years old with bipolar disorder. Now, what I say is every toddler is bipolar, just as we talked about in terms of emotional intensity just a few minutes ago. So this is an example of one of the problems in our system. So resilience is the ability to bounce back. And my thing, I have a kind of a pet peeve about resilience, because when I used to work in domestic violence prevention, I was working with kids, and people would say to me all the time, "Oh, well, children are resilient; they'll bounce back." And the domestic violence at that point in time, around 20-ish years ago, it was really more focused on supporting the moms. Now, that's central. Of course, the moms need to be safe and fed and housed, and they need to have jobs and healing, and that will help their kids. But that's not enough. The kids also need direct support. And I had to advocate and fight with people tooth and nail at the agencies where I worked, at the county, on the Children's Issues Domestic Violence Council, in order to really work to get people to integrate that. And in my interview, we'd actually talked about counseling that I wanted to do with the kids. And once I got there, they just wanted me to do childcare for the moms. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. Give me clinical supervision and allow me to use what I've learned in my master's program in order to serve these children. And so I was able to do that. I mean, I would have left if they didn't allow me to do that. And I worked with other amazing people at the county level in Santa Clara to really try to advocate for integrating healing services for children. Oh, I have the story about Oprah. I mean, the other thing people say is children are resilient. You look at Oprah. She's had hard experiences. Well, first of all, most of us are not Oprah. Just there are unique things about humans, and Oprah's an especially unique human. But second of all, she had a support system. We need to be children's support systems every chance that we can get. And we can take care of ourselves as we take care of children, as we respond to them, and figure out how to do that at the same time. It's not two separate things like Western culture makes it. Oh, you have to take care of yourself first and do yoga, and then you can take care of kids. That might be your sanity. Maybe yoga is, but maybe your sanity is doing yoga with kids. Maybe it's finding ways to breathe deeply while you're with children. So I think this idea that it has to be separate is really problematic. So next. Okay. So we've talked about some of these issues, but these are the places where children have challenges after they have trauma: self-regulation, emotional adaptability, relating to others, and self-understandings. And all of the strategies we've been talking about in class help with these things. So I don't know if I have to say that much about it, but I'll talk a little bit more about trauma in another micro lecture and relationship building interventions that we can use that are in addition to what we've already talked about in class. So we've talked about this as well. This is a little bit of a review of the impact of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And this is one of my favorite quotes about children. In order to develop normally, a child requires progressively more complex joint activity with one or more adults who have an irrational emotional relationship with the child. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. That's number one, first, last, and always. And another quote: contrary to popular belief, young children can and do experience significant mental health problems early in life that are comparable in severity and have lasting effects This is really serious. This is serious business. I'm really happy that you're here.